True War Encounters, Jake McNiece. How Jake McNiece used FN Model 1930 in 1944 with disciplined fire to pin enemy movement. Hidden. The Belgian-made FN Model 1930 lay half-buried beside a cratered farmhouse wall in Normandy, its barrel still warm. Jake McNiece crouched low, rain hammering his helmet, and pulled the machine gun free with both hands. German voices echoed across hedgerows 200 meters out, closer than they should be, moving faster than intelligence had promised. He checked the belt feed. Maybe 200 rounds. Not enough for the wild, suppressive fire paratroopers usually relied on. Not enough for anything except precision. Behind him, 3 men from the Filthy 13 waited in a drainage ditch, soaked and exhausted. They'd been dropped 4 kilometers off target the night before during the Normandy jump, lost their primary explosives in flooded fields, and stumbled into this abandoned Belgian farmstead at dawn with nothing but rifles and the knowledge that a German mechanized column was pushing toward Carentan. Division needed this road, held for 6 hours. McNiece had found the FN 20 minutes ago, beside 2 dead Wehrmacht soldiers and a burned-out Kubelwagen. He had no idea if the gun still worked. The mission wasn't supposed to be his. The Filthy 13 had dropped into France, with orders to demolish a stone bridge 3 kilometers south, cutting off reinforcements before they reached Utah Beach. But the C-47 had taken flak over the coast, scattered the stick across marshland, and McNiece's squad had landed alone, separated from their lieutenant, their explosives, and any plan worth following. By sunrise, they'd linked up with 2 stray 502nd paratroopers and realized they were sitting on the only defensible position between the Germans and a critical supply route. McNiece had always been the demolitions man, not the machine gunner. His talent was calculating blast radius, wiring primer cord, turning bridges into rubble with surgical timing. He trusted explosives because they were predictable. But suppressive fire was different. Suppressive fire required discipline, and discipline was the one thing McNiece's service record said he didn't have. Too stubborn, too rebellious. The Filthy 13 had earned their reputation through results, not obedience. But staring at the FN Model 1930, McNiece understood the math had changed. If he opened up with long bursts, instinct, adrenaline, he'd burn through ammunition in 90 seconds and leave his men exposed. The only way to hold this farmhouse was to make every burst count. 3 to 5 round bursts, aimed fire, disciplined fire, the kind of shooting that required patience and the ability to let targets move without flinching, the kind that went against every combat reflex he had. "Mac," someone whispered. "They're flanking left." McNiece didn't answer. He braced the FN against the wall, sighted down the hedgerow, and waited. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. Part 2. Shadows moved between trees. 8, maybe 10 Germans advancing in staggered bounds through the Normandy bocage. McNiece's finger rested on the trigger. Every instinct screamed to fire now, to lay down a wall of lead. But he held. 40 meters. 30. 25. Then he squeezed. 3 rounds, sharp and controlled. 1 German dropped. The others dove for cover, shouting. McNiece shifted aim, fired again. 4 rounds. Another soldier hit. Then silence. The Germans didn't know how many guns were firing. They didn't know McNiece was alone on the FN. They hesitated, regrouping behind a hedgerow, trying to identify the threat. That hesitation bought 30 seconds. Private Kowalski crawled up beside him, face pale. "That's it? That's all you're giving them?" McNiece didn't look away from the sight picture. "That's all we got. They're gonna rush us." "Maybe, but they don't know that yet." The words sounded more confident than McNiece felt. His hands were trembling slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of the choice he'd just made. Back at Fort Benning, instructors had drilled automatic weapons doctrine into every paratrooper. Sustained fire, suppression, volume. Keep the enemy's heads down. make them respect the gun. But those instructors had never mentioned what happened when you only had 200 rounds and 6 hours to hold. The FN Model 1930 was heavier than the Browning 30 cal McNiece had trained on. Belgian engineering, solid and reliable, but the recoil pattern was different. After the third round, the barrel wanted to climb. He'd have to compensate constantly, recalibrate after every burst. It wasn't just marksmanship, it was a conversation with the weapon, learning its rhythm under fire. Kowalski was still staring at him. "Sarge, we got maybe 300 yards of open ground behind us. If they figure out we're under strength, then we make sure they don't figure it out." McNiece's mind was already working through the mathematics. 10 Germans, maybe more in reserve. If each probe cost them 1 or 2 casualties, they'd pull back, regroup, try a different angle. That meant repositioning after every engagement, never firing from the same spot twice, creating the illusion of a larger defensive force. It meant fighting like a demolitions man, precise, calculated, making every resource count. The rain intensified, turning the farmhouse courtyard into slick mud. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled. American or German, impossible to tell. McNiece glanced at the belt feed. He'd fired 7 rounds, 193 remaining. The math was getting tighter. "They're moving again," Kowalski hissed. McNiece shifted position, dragging the FN to a window on the farmhouse's north side. Through the rain, he could see Germans advancing from a different angle, testing the perimeter. Smart, aggressive, coordinated. He settled into a firing stance, exhaled slowly, and waited for the range to close. Part 3. For 2 hours, McNiece fought a war of calculations. The Germans probed from 3 directions, testing the farmhouse defenses with small advances near the Normandy hedgerows, trying to draw fire and locate positions. Each time, McNiece waited until they committed, then fired short, controlled bursts, never more than 5 rounds, never from the same angle twice. He moved constantly, dragging the FN Model 1930 from window to wall to ditch, repositioning after every engagement. His squad mates stayed low, conserving rifle ammunition, trusting McNiece's judgment, even when German voices grew close enough to hear individual words. Kowalski handled the belt feed, keeping it from snagging. The 2 502nd strays covered the rear approach. Everyone understood the situation without saying it. If McNiece's arithmetic failed, they were finished. The FN became an extension of McNiece's will. He learned its rhythm, the slight upward pull after the third round, the way the barrel heated and shifted point of impact. He adjusted, compensated, fired only when the mathematics of angle, distance, and ammunition expenditure made sense. It wasn't heroism, it wasn't even bravery, it was demolition thinking applied to machine gun fire, precision over power, timing over volume. Kowalski broke the silence during a lull. "You ever think about what they teach us versus what actually works?" McNiece didn't look away from the hedgerow. "Every damn day. Benning instructors would have a heart attack watching this. Benning instructors aren't sitting here with 200 rounds and 6 hours to hold." The comment hung in the rain-soaked air. McNiece had spent 3 years arguing with officers about the difference between what the manual said and what the ground demanded. The filthy 13's reputation, undisciplined, rebellious, impossible to control, came from that gap. But McNiece knew the truth was more complicated. Real discipline wasn't blind obedience. It was understanding the tool, respecting the limitations, making chaos serve a purpose. Lieutenant Graves appeared in the doorway, mud-caked and tense. He'd been coordinating with another scattered element 200 meters south, trying to piece together a coherent defensive line from the wreckage of the Normandy drop. "McNiece, how much longer can you hold? Depends on how smart they are." "That's not an answer." McNiece glanced at the belt feed. 80 rounds remaining. 3 more probes, maybe 4. Then we're on rifles and grenades. Graves stared at the FN Model 1930, then at McNiece. "Division says relief is coming. 2 hours, maybe 3. We'll be out of ammo in 90 minutes. The lieutenant's jaw tightened. McNiece could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. The weight of men's lives balanced against incomplete information and shifting timelines. It was the same calculation McNiece had been making all morning, except Graves had bars on his collar and a command structure expecting answers. "Do what you can," Graves finally said, and disappeared back into the rain. Kowalski waited until the lieutenant was gone. He's scared. He should be. McNiece shifted position again, moving the FN to cover the eastern approach. We all should be. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Part 4. By mid-morning, the Germans had pulled back twice, regrouped, and tried a coordinated push from two sides. McNiece met them with the same cold arithmetic. 4-round burst, left flank. Shift position, 3-round burst, right side. Move again. The belt feed grew shorter, 60 rounds, 50, 40. Each burst had to matter more than the last. Then the German officer made a mistake. Frustrated by the stalled advance through the Normandy farmstead, he ordered a frontal assault, 2 squads rushing the farmhouse simultaneously, betting that McNiece's ammunition was exhausted. They were half right. McNiece had 37 rounds left when the first wave broke cover. He fired in 5-round increments, methodical and unhurried. 2 men in the lead element dropped. The rest hit the ground. The second wave hesitated. McNiece shifted the FN's muzzle, exhaled, and fired again. 3 rounds, then 4. The mathematics was perfect. The execution was flawless. But his hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from something deeper. The awareness that he was making life and death decisions with the same precision he'd once used to calculate blast radius. Kowalski was counting under his breath. 14 rounds left. Jesus, Mac! McNiece didn't answer. The Germans were regrouping again, confused by the resistance. He could hear their NCO shouting, trying to rally them for another push, but they'd lost momentum, lost confidence. They didn't know the FN Model 1930 was nearly dry. Then the bolt locked back, empty. McNiece stared at the smoking barrel, then at the hedgerow. The silence felt enormous. His ears rang from hours of controlled fire. His shoulders ached from dragging the gun across the farmhouse. His throat was raw from breathing cordite smoke. But the Germans stayed pinned behind cover, convinced the farmhouse was still a fortress. "Mac," Kowalski whispered, "what do we do?" McNiece's mind raced through options. They had rifles, grenades, but if the Germans realized the machine gun was silent, they'd overrun the position in minutes. The only advantage left was the illusion of strength, the belief that disciplined, precise fire meant overwhelming firepower. He pulled the bolt back, let it slam forward with a metallic crack that echoed across the farmhouse. Repeated the motion. Made it sound like he was clearing a jam, buying time, keeping the threat alive in German minds. It worked. The Germans stayed down. Seconds stretched into minutes. McNiece's heart hammered against his ribs. This was the moment demolitions training never prepared him for, the space between the last explosion and the silence after, when you didn't know if the structure would hold or collapse. Then mortars began falling on German positions, friendly fire from a battalion that had finally caught up to the front. The road stayed open. The supply line held. When Lieutenant Graves returned an hour later, he found McNiece sitting against the farmhouse wall, the FN Model 1930 resting across his knees. The lieutenant stared at the empty belt feed, the scorched barrel, the mud-caked weapon. "How many did you kill?" McNiece shrugged. "Didn't count. Kept them off the road." Graves looked at him for a long moment, then at the weapon, then back at McNiece's face. "How did you make 200 rounds last 2 hours?" McNiece didn't have an answer that would fit in a report. "How do you explain that discipline isn't obedience? It's understanding when to fire and when to wait. That real control means fighting every instinct to empty the gun." Part 5. The truth. McNiece never told anyone, not in after-action reports, not to the other Filthy 13, not even decades later when historians asked about Normandy, was how close it came to falling apart. When the bolt had locked back on that empty chamber, his first instinct wasn't tactical genius. It was pure panic. For 3 seconds, that felt like hours, McNiece had frozen, staring at the useless weapon in his hands, while German voices shouted orders 50 meters away. His mind had gone blank. Not the controlled blankness of focus, but the terrible emptiness of a man who'd just run out of options. Kowalski had seen it. McNiece caught the private's eyes in that moment, wide, terrified, waiting for the NCO to do something, anything. That look was what broke the paralysis. Not courage, not training. Just the simple, crushing responsibility of being the man other men looked to when everything was falling apart. The bolt-slamming trick hadn't been clever improvisation. It had been desperation dressed up as confidence. McNiece had yanked that bolt back because his hands needed something to do, because staying still meant accepting they were finished, because movement, any movement, felt better than helplessness. And when the Germans had stayed down, when that desperate bluff had actually worked, McNiece hadn't felt relief or triumph. He'd felt sick, because he understood, with absolute clarity, that the line between disciplined fire and ran out of bullets and got lucky was thinner than anyone would ever know. The official citation would later describe exceptional fire discipline under sustained enemy pressure and tactical acumen in the employment of captured weapons systems. Mordu. But McNiece would remember the trembling in his hands, the blank moment of terror, and the awful knowledge that everything, the road held, the line intact, the men alive, had balanced on 3 seconds of luck and a German officer who'd made the wrong guess. Private Kowalski never spoke about what he'd seen in McNiece's face when the gun went dry, but something changed between them after Normandy. The private started checking McNiece's demolition charges more carefully, double-timing supply runs, volunteering for the dangerous work without being asked. Not out of hero worship, out of understanding. He'd seen the legend crack, seen the scared human underneath, and decided that man was worth following anyway. Years later, McNiece would smell cordite at a construction site, just a whiff of blasting powder, and his hands would start shaking. Not from the memory of German infantry or machine gun fire, but from the 3 seconds when he'd stared at an empty weapon and known, absolutely known, he had nothing left to give. The medals and mission reports never mentioned that moment. They couldn't. But it lived in McNiece's chest, in the space between his heartbeats, in the taste of copper in his mouth, whenever he thought about Normandy. That was the secret the FN Model 1930 carried. Discipline wasn't the opposite of fear. It was what you did with fear when running out of ammunition, and luck meant choosing between freezing or bluffing, and somehow making the bluff work. Part 6. The farmhouse near Carentan became just another reference point on operational maps. Coordinates, unit movements, casualty figures reduced to clean paragraphs. Battalion reported that a small paratroop element successfully delayed enemy movement at a critical junction. The FN Model 1930 disappeared into some supply depot, another piece of captured equipment redistributed or scrapped. McNiece returned to the Filthy 13's scattered remnants, helped rig demolitions on 3 more bridges before Normandy was declared secure, and never mentioned the empty magazine to anyone outside Kowalski's quiet understanding. Officers who'd heard about the farmhouse stand offered approving nods, clapped his shoulder, called it good work. None of them asked how it felt to bet everything on 200 rounds and a mathematical prayer. Lieutenant Graves put McNiece in for a commendation. McNiece declined, citing the entire squad's effort. The paperwork disappeared into the usual channels. Later, Graves would tell his grandchildren about a demolition sergeant who'd held a road with captured equipment and impossible odds, simplifying the story into something cleaner, more heroic, easier to understand than the truth of 3 blank seconds and desperate improvisation. 6 weeks after Normandy, during a night jump into Holland for Market Garden, McNiece found himself crouched in another farmhouse, another enemy patrol approaching, another moment demanding choices that would live longer than the mission reports. The pattern would repeat: scattered drops, lost equipment, ground that never matched the intelligence maps, and McNiece calculating blast radius, while officers looked to him for solutions he was making up in real time. The Filthy 13's reputation grew, rebellious, undisciplined, effective in ways that made commanders uncomfortable. McNiece's name appeared in stories, some accurate, some exaggerated, all missing the private arithmetic of fear and responsibility that made each action possible. He learned to live with the gap between what people said happened and what he remembered feeling. That gap was just another kind of frontline terrain, as real as hedgerows and canals. 40 years later, McNiece sat in his Oklahoma living room while a freight train rumbled past on distant tracks. The rhythmic percussion of steel on steel triggered something, not exactly memory, more like muscle memory, of tension. His hands moved unconsciously to count rounds that weren't there, finger tapping out the 3 to 5 burst pattern on his knee. His wife noticed. "You okay?" McNiece nodded, not quite lying. The train faded into distance. The moment passed. But for a few seconds, he'd been back at that farmhouse wall, Belgian machine gun hot in his hands, doing the math on how to make nothing last forever. The legend said Jake McNiece was fearless, undisciplined, brilliant under fire. The truth was simpler and harder. He was a man who'd learned that real discipline meant carrying impossible weight, making impossible choices, and living with the knowledge that the difference between heroism and disaster was sometimes just 3 seconds of bluff and a belt feed running dry at exactly the wrong or right moment. That was the weight the FN Model 1930 carried into history, into reports, into stories. And that was the weight McNiece carried alone, in the quiet spaces between what people needed to believe and what he couldn't forget. If this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.